Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I did some programming today.
So you don't do it often enough?
I don't do it often enough. I don't touch, yeah, I do not. And it was good to get my hands dirty a little bit. I worked on a program to against the security scorecard API, just to test out to see if I can get it working. So
Oh, cool.
it works. I'm very happy about that. But I don't remember what we said we were going to talk about in today's call, Christine. So do you have a clearer idea?
Yeah. I know that there was some feedback that you had gotten from the end users group for the SCM guide, and there was some feedback that I had gotten from sharing it with the to-do group. I believe we wanted to talk about that. We also wanted to talk to Norm if he joined about any changes related to the structure, like regenerating in the, I have to remember exactly what, but I remember that there was some like little things that are in the guide right now that we may or may not want in there. We also wanted to talk about, there was some links that in the documents that I created that didn't really go to any new material because we didn't have them. For example, the operations, there's some things that don't have any links to actually any content. So we wanted to talk about that. And I think we may also want to talk about the roadmap in general. Blog posts, announcements, things like that.
Okay, so let's break that down.
Yeah, let me see. I find the agenda.
Just putting it in the agenda now. So, oops. Last time we talked about your PR.
Mhm.
This time, I know. Links in the docs. So sorry, can you go through the things again so that I can?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one is just like the feedback that you and I have received, like discussing the feedback from the end users group and the to-do group. Yeah.
Okay. Can people mark themselves in the best? We're in here. So I put a little mini agenda up at the top of that document. If you're here, then please mark yourself in. Okay. Christine, do you want to? I'm happy to take notes as we get here, but Christine, do you want to start off with some of the feedback you've received, or?
Yeah, and I'd also drop the feedback, so maybe I can just get the feedback from Slack so I don't have to retype it. But I got some feedback from the to-do group. The main one is that some folks actually do love best practices guides, but they also sometimes don't like them because one of the main concerns is that there might be some drift, like some policies could be like put together and applied, but over time there would be some drift. So they were really more interested in a framing around why it's important, but also how to kind of continually enforce those policies. So they were looking for advice around tooling or anything that might actually help with that effort. And they mentioned some gaps that might exist in GitHub that don't allow you to do things like policy as code. So if there's any recommendations around that, that would be something that they would love to see in the guides.
Did they mean like that there is a drift in the policy definition, whether it's still relevant, maybe, I don't know, an update to the SCM happened, or in the
No,
government where they have a policy for some repos, but they create the new ones and they don't comply with the policy.
or even that they have the policy, so your second one, but it could also be that they have some policy applied and then somebody like reverts some policy, like if they don't have a way to check that something actually is continually being compliant.
So it sounds to me like this is what Legitify solves. Just run the tool against the server and you get the policies, and maybe like in a periodic manner or a pull request check or something like this. But is it something else?
Yeah, they actually specifically, it could be like something like run those continuously, but I guess that's not really mentioned, or if there was like any tools that help people do this easily. They were also looking at things like safe settings. Let me see if I can drop the links. Let me just drop my notes here. But there was also, they looked at something like safe settings from GitHub, which can actually help with some of those things. That's something that could run automatically, I think, is what they were looking at.
Considering that the info itself is coming from Legitify, does it make sense to make that more clear that that tools like Legitify exist and link directly to
Yeah,
them?
that is true, because yeah, even in the whole doc, there's no mention of Legitify. So even as you say, run the policy checks. You didn't really tell anyone about how to run the policy check.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have so much noise over here, so I'm going to switch room because I can't hear you.
Can you not hear me? Is the noise on my end?
No, it's from here. We have it's the happy hour time.
Yeah, you're a couple hours ahead of us.
Yeah, it's almost weekend.
Oh, yeah.
Could you repeat what you said?
I was just going to say, or I said maybe we need to, first of all, explicitly mention Legitify, considering the best practice info is coming from there, and also maybe we need the section of the intro, which is talking about tools. We could talk about Legitify, we could talk about Scorecard, because I know Scorecard is planning to add, or they're as we know, we talked to them and they're planning to add more applicable data points in their checker as well. So so maybe we should add that to the front matter of the document, is my point.
That's true. Yeah, because in some of the documents I have internally, I do actually kind of like specifically say that we're going to run these audits and then we're going to run them periodically, but that didn't really make it into the guide.
When you talk about drift, it reminds me of how people talk about the infrastructure as code drift, where you deploy something and then the settings of the environment that you've deployed into drift away from the settings that you've. So I think this is, again, it points to the need for tools.
Exactly. And they said that at least that there's been a gap. So they were actually saying maybe even within the OpenSSF group can either influence or work with GitHub and GitLab and all to see if that they could actually even implement some of these things on their tooling specifically, because it can get kind of frustrating. Because the SCMs don't provide out of the box features as I listed for policy as code to help with this. And then the other thing that they also wanted as feedback is just having more, rather than best practices, they actually wanted to see more examples, people sharing use cases and scenarios. They said that would be helpful.
Like,
And right, the example they actually said is that when license compliance was sort of like kicking off and people would talk about that, a lot of best practices would be shared because that's usually the best first step. But now a lot of those groups that have been working together have been actually sharing data in terms of how are they using it internally at their companies, and actually sharing not just the best practices, but actually data about this is how you should set things up. It's a little bit more opinionated, but in the beginning, it might have been people were a little bit more reluctant to share like their posture for how they're doing compliance, good reasons, but now they've kind of gotten over that hump. And they think that we should probably also move towards that direction.
I mean,
Yeah, use cases, case studies, stuff like that.
yeah, I see.
Mhm.
I think we would need people to contribute that material. Also, I don't think we are I don't think we want to be a Stack Overflow. Right? Maybe we can.
Is that yeah, I know. Is there other OpenSSF working groups where they actually are doing something similar, where people are, even if it's not a Stack Overflow, people are actually contributing case studies?
I think it's kind of a paradox, because you cannot do a case study on the document before it's published, because no one uses it yet.
Yeah,
Well,
this
yeah.
is more like a roadmap. This is like a roadmap. Like they say, if we put it in our roadmap for the future.
Yeah, sounds good.
I mean, because I was thinking, simplistically speaking, we could set up a discussion in the GitHub that and encourage people to ask questions, and then use that as a way to oh, hey, we didn't address that issue. That's to prompt us, or in general to add things or be clearer about something. If people ask a question about the material, that's a good that can be a good way to evolve material by generating discussion around it using the GitHub discussion mechanism, because it's built into GitHub. So
Yeah, that'd be useful. I know that the reason why some of the feedback was coming was within the to-do group, they also have like a GitHub area for to-do groups. So if they're discussing things like job descriptions, you'll see a bunch of companies will drop like a markdown file in there for the job description. It's very opinionated for them, or for other ways that they set up certain things, how they do policies, how they do things like contributing guidelines. And those are really useful for somebody who's new and trying to set up something similar, have an example to look at. So that's kind of like where they're coming from. Like a lot of people share these so-called case studies, and because somebody could come and say, oh yeah, this is the case study for how, say, F5 set up their SCM best practices guideline. And it's interesting to use that as well as the best practices together.
all right. Geez. From my end, when I presented at the end user working group, I didn't get much didn't get too much feedback other than good feedback, positive feedback. I mean, I'm looking at the notes from the end user working group call right now, and one of the things that came up was somebody, Jacques, asked about the relationship with other OpenSSF work, and is there an intersection with Salsa and Scorecard? And I did mention that we'd already talked to Scorecard folks, so that was in hand. But I don't have enough knowledge about the Salsa work to know how we should be engaging there. So Joshua said that he would have a discussion with the Salsa folks, or he would try to lead that discussion. And
I have some in the Salsa framework, so it is divided to several areas of the SDLC. So you have the source code, the build, the CI, the Artifactory registries, and the deployment.
Yeah.
And these documents like checks many of the requirements for the source code part, because they require that you have a code review. So we have a policy for that, and they require that you have a SSO for users and all this stuff. So there are many points in this level that we meet.
So it's yeah, okay.
Yeah, and when I was doing the presentation that I did at the Open Source Summit in Vancouver, I actually threw up the Salsa diagram as sort of like in the beginning, kind of like framing for some of these. Then I dove into the source part and even talked about things related to the dependencies, because even with some of the settings, it's supposed to help with the dependency management. So yeah, so I did do it but I didn't like kind of like tie it, like if you want to get to Salsa has these different levels. With increasing levels, you are testing that you're, I guess, more secure, but I didn't get to like, this will map you to the Salsa level. I didn't do that. I'm not sure if that's what they were getting at as well.
I think that's for further discussion. Yeah, I mean, but it sounds like it sounds like some thinking has already gone on there, so great. The other thing was that I stressed when I presented the material, the relationship to the OSPOs, and you know how people in OSPOs generally are kind of seen as a target for this. And obviously, sorry?
What is OSPOS?
Open Source Program Office.
Okay.
Right, sorry. So like, and because this is the end user group, we were talking with end users in their language means big companies that that are using open source, so are likely to have something like an open source program office, but are less contributory than technology companies, right? So the main example, or not the main example, but one example is Citibank. Jonathan, who chairs the group, is from Citibank. So, but you know, so banks are an example, healthcare. That's the kind of company that we're talking about, and a lot of them have open source program offices. That's not, and also it's a very, as discussed many times in this group, it's a very kind of fuzzy definition of what an end user is, and also it's not an end user in terms of like the person walking along on the street with their phone, which is my definition of an end user. But you know, that's the point being that many of these people are not only working for OSPO type organizations, whether or not their company calls it an OSPO or not, but they're playing that role, but they're also involved in OSPO, in other OSPO communities, So we heard from somebody who said that they were part of a financial related OSPO community, and that they would raise awareness of this work there, and that we might get some feedback from that channel. And basically, I just offered myself up to funnel any feedback. And so far, I haven't received much additional feedback, but that was just last week. So.
I actually also started presenting that internally at Microsoft, and did get a number of kind of technical questions about the scalability of some of the rules. And I think that brings back to the difference between organizations which have many open source activity, both as maintainers and as consumers, versus those that consume. Like specifically, I was asked about things like enterprise should not allow members to create public reports or invite outside collaborators, which just for us at Microsoft, it was hard to like scale the Microsoft DOS or Azure samples orgs without allowing those. But again, that's different consumptions of the best practices guide, maybe.
Yeah, and that's actually useful, because even within us, as we're kind of like going in and trying to implement this, certain orgs will sort of have different styles of doing things. And this is where, like I was saying, the case studies could help, because even internally, if something is like a samples, we may allow them to do more. And I think that actually did come up, I forgot, that did come up in our discussions. They said that different orgs might have different security setups, or so even just kind of like knowing that if you had like a case study or something, like if you have like a main org, which is like your crown jewels, probably want to be a lot more stricter about it. But if you have something that is more like experimental or demos or something that's supporting
Like
articles,
labs,
then
yeah.
you are a little bit more forgiving.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of like where the guides or best practice or case studies might come in and help someone.
Yeah, I think like we propose a best practices document. It's not mandatory for everyone to apply all the policies, but I think we suggested in one of the meetings that we would tag each policy with which the audience it's related to. So maybe some policies maybe we can like all these enterprise policies to tag them that only for like closed source organizations or something like that, or just to in the beginning to be more precise on who the audience or how should the people read the document, and like lead them in the reading. Now, yeah, actually, this document it's broader than the open source community. Like,
yeah,
I mean, maybe even most of the policies are not best suited for open source organizations or repositories.
Really, you would say? Like I'm trying to.
Yeah, okay. So I prefer not to say. But I think all the public ones that like creating public, because for a closed organization it's not a best practice. and the outside collaborators. And
So yeah, maybe inner source versus open source kind of a distinction can be an interesting experiment we can do,
I can think of-
or really make it more understandable, like in the initial paragraph. That
yeah,
I like the idea of having some more material at the front about how people should read this document, and I'm willing to have myself, I mean, I can, oops. I'm willing to take a stab at that. Unless you want to, unless somebody else wants to volunteer, I would be more than willing to take a stab at writing a couple of paragraphs about how you should read this document, including that kind of framing. The other thing that comes to mind is, you know, I work for an organization that has an enterprise GitHub account and many private repos as well as public repos, right? And one of the things that I work on, that I'm kind of overseeing, is the process by which things go from one side of that divide to the other. And there's a bunch of checks that are required. Okay, make sure that if you're to take your private thing and make it public, then make sure that it has a license, make sure that it has a this and that, and that you've done all these checks and stuff like that. That's another kind of best practice use case type study that I'm sure might be useful, actually, for many organizations.
Yeah, I did have a section in our internal document that talked about, with the context of this, when you're going from private to public, what are the checks that you want to make sure that are in there? It was in the operations section, but I didn't like pass out the operations into all of these different types of things that you could be doing.
so let's write like a bulleted list of all the sections we want to add, or someone's tracking that.
Well, I'm taking some notes about what we've written, what we've talked about so far in this document here. But if you want to riff on that a little bit, because I agree with you about writing stuff down.
To feel the progress. Mhm. So if I just a quick recall, so we have the intro that I don't remember what exactly we wanted to add. Yeah, okay. So we have the tooling part. We have the, I don't know, maybe we can call it like going public section. Might be good.
So sorry, what was the first thing that you just said?
Tooling.
The tooling.
Yeah. And we have the going public section.
All right. Okay.
We have the how to read this document. So maybe we can
We talked about more in-depth studies or something like that, which is a little bit more fuzzy for me, because I think that we need to figure out what those case studies are, but we may not be ready to write those yet, right?
Yeah, I don't think we're ready, because it'll have to kind of come through companies, and they'll probably have to get people to say yes. We could always have something where saying you're open to contribute your case study, and we can see that.
Yeah. So another bullet is to like start a community, or how to contribute, make
Right.
some forum for discussions.
So we can raise that on the next best practices call. And I can raise to a proposed use of GitHub discussions.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
yeah, and another thing that like you said, moving from public to private, but internally, I also had all of these different use cases, like, and I don't think we need to get into it. It's more like if somebody was, sometimes repos get transferred from one organization externally to another. So there's all these like, almost like integration points where you need to run these checks, where you have to make sure things are actually doing well, because they may not happen all the time, but they do happen. So I don't know if we need to be prescriptive about like going public, but it's like whenever, yeah.
Do you think you have some material from that could be adapted, that could be made into a pull request?
It could, yeah, I could probably just like set something up and then we can discuss it, because it might be like the guide might get too big or whatever, but it might be like people can kind of look at it and say, oh, this is overkill or this is useful.
Okay. Does somebody want to, do you want to take a stab at the tooling thing?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll take a stab at the how to read this document. So I'll do a PR on that.
Awesome. By the way, I have a open PR.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Shall we review that as well then?
Uh,
Idea, right?
the best kind of review is auto approve, in my opinion. Yes.
And
We should add it to the document in the beginning. Yeah, so I wish I noticed that the enterprise policies were missing, so the link
Yeah.
broken. So I just added that.
Do we know why that fails the link? Like, is that something we can fix at the export level?
If we know what failed the links, basically I just, when we added the enterprise policies to Lisify, I didn't regenerate the policies for them. I just updated the main page with the table of contents, but not the specific policies. So it linked to a non-existent file.
So that's.
but I
And there are multiple consecutive black lines errors as well.
But that, I think a lot of that is fixed in the PR that just sent. Is it?
I
Actually,
think
okay.
the issues are on the PR.
Okay. I see there is a markdown linter now, so I'll fix that, and probably it will change all the files, because if it's new, so all the policies are not complying with this linter.
Oh dear. Okay, well, as long as
It
you
was
don't,
added when they refactored the whole access and stuff on the repos.
as long as it doesn't clobber the README files, then it should be fine.
That was one of the things, Dan, that you wanted to discuss, is almost like a process. You wanted to like clarify with Noam what would be the process going forward, or if there's like an update to a policy or new policies, what would that look like?
I think we discussed it already, but just to clarify that, like, I think that the way that we're looking at it is, if there's something if there's a change to one of the singleton policy pages, then that should be regenerated through the directly, programmatically from your data. But if there's a change that needs to be made to one of the README files, one of the markdowns, then we should be doing that kind of more manually at this point, because we're adding so much editorial everywhere, but we're not adding editorial to the individual files that's not reflected already in the Legitify data. So
Okay, and it would, yeah, got it. And it would be done through a PR process.
yeah, everything should be done through a PR process.
Okay.
But I think the other thing that we need to do is we need to establish from a roadmap perspective. I know Noam's always talking about roadmap, and that's really good. We should right now this data is only available, but the URLs for these data for everything is github.com/OSSF/blah/blob/this/that, whereas it probably should be at a more published at a more friendly URL. That could be the canonical URL for the SCM guide, right? Maybe it's something like scmguide.openssf.org or something like that, and it gets published using GitHub pages. So we can also, maybe we can chat with the OpenSSF folks about setting that up, because that's something that's like admin work that we can ask them to help with, basically, is what I was thinking.
Okay. Maybe bring it up at the best practices working group, because they have other guides as well.
Yeah. That is a good idea. So
I think we also have an issue we can review. I think it was opened after the end users meeting.
let me just write down what I just said so that I remember it. Okay, so issue. Let's take a look at the issue. Add Azure DevOps.
So another meta question, maybe for Noam, like for some of these things that I would say, like Azure or some of the new things, do they get added as one-off separate markdown files, or do they kind of go through, it gets added to Legitify, and then from Legitify it gets regenerated? What's the best way to do this?
Kind of a Legitify question more than a.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
for now we can add it just in Markdown, and Legitify can, when we'll implement Azure DevOps, we'll just keep the structure from the guide into Legitify. So when we'll generate the document, it will be the same. So if the policies are added to the document earlier, we will handle it internally. And if Legitify will do it earlier, so it's just normal process of generating the document and creating a pull request.
I think that might be also useful. Is I'm just gonna drop a link for an example of what one of the Legitify has. Actions can approve pull request.md. If you look at that, it seems like there is some sort of like structure or format to how you name certain things, including like for this particular link, I have policy name actions_can approve. Like that is actually listed in there. Is there something that you want to, for the new stuff to have some kind of similar format or approved format or
Yeah, yeah.
again, yeah.
It would be super helpful if we can adopt this format for all policies. Like a base structure for a policy. That sounds
So
good.
what do we say? What do we say about Robert's request here? It's a little vague.
I mean, he suggested to add the policies, no?
Should we tell him to file a PR and then would we have to educate him on some of the different ways? Like, do you have to create another folder called Azure, like whatever it's Azure, and then do it in this format? That's sort of like,
But won't Noam's next update, like, let's say Robert, sorry, I'm sorry if I mispronounce his name, but let's say he adds also to the main SCM guide, right? So now we have 3 icons. Now that has to go also to Noam's action, I guess, right?
Is there any acceptance criteria for like which you know, obviously GitHub is very huge in open source, right? My intention isn't to gatekeep what SCM services are being allowed, but I'm just asking the question, is this meant to be all encompassing? Just if something is out there, people are using it, there should be some tailored best practices for that.
I think the idea was when we started off with GitHub and GitLab is to be able to say, okay, well, let's start with those and then expand to other SCM platforms as appropriate. And I don't know what the acceptance criteria should be. I think it's up to us to figure out what the acceptance criteria should be. I mean, my kind of starting view would be if there's a rough consensus in this group and, you know, in the best practices group itself as well, that we should add a platform to the SCM guide, then we should probably do that. However, we shouldn't just allow anything willy-nilly. There needs to be a kind of we need to maintain oversight over it. So that should ideally be done through the PR process, but PR is an issue, that is, you know, so that we keep things kind of transparent.
I think that's a great idea. Because in my mind, it almost seems like if there should be some sort of like criteria, even if it's a low bar, that you should at least have like things like branch protection, 2FA, and maybe some very basic things at the very least.
Can I also offer maybe impact on open source supply chain? Because I guess open source like OSSF its intention is not to provide open source security tools, right? To increase the level of security in open source like software. So maybe one metric which we can add new SCMs is based on, does it allow for open source projects?
That
I think that's a fair point. If I'm understanding it correctly, that the tooling that we're providing recommendations for should be friendly to open source projects.
yeah.
I know very little, almost nothing about Azure DevOps. Might have been the first time I had heard about this as an SCM. I've worked in the Microsoft stack in a previous life where we did use things like Team Foundation Server, but never like a service. It's
What Avishai just said sounds very dangerously close to like a mission and vision statement. So I don't know. It could be that we need something like that, I guess is what I'm saying, in a kind of sarcastic way, that we should have like a documented alongside of the README file, we should have a kind of charter, basically, that amongst other things says, in line with the work, in line with the purposes of the OpenSSF, we are we're considering multiple source code management platforms, and one of the considerations is, does it allow for open source projects? Is it enabling open source projects? Sorry if I jumped in there. It just feels like that's another to-do item that to add to our road.
Yeah.
Yep.
Also, it's a great idea. Yet, as the roadmap advocates, I think we should freeze for now the addition of extra SCMs, and like get to the roadmap and get to V01 with the now, and then add more SCMs. But of course, the process in which we need to align, legitify, and the progress of the document it's need to be discussed, but maybe later.
Yeah, I think that'd be fair, because you could also say that in this version on V1, you are going to be like these two big ones, but then in the future roadmap or at the end of that, you'll have something to consider additional SCMs, including the criteria that is in the future roadmap.
my cursory investigation reveals that this Azure DevOps is not a home for open source projects.
It's not.
Does not appear to be equivalent to things like GitLab or.
Well, we can use GNOME's freezing mechanism to push back on it for now, and then open up the discussion after. I think that's a good approach.
Because I don't know, nothing came from Bitbucket. Is Bitbucket still? Because
It's still happening.
okay, because that could be a future one if somebody wants to do it.
I think, from my knowledge, so every SCM has the option to create a public repository, but they are not a good platform to create open source projects. It's very hard to find new projects or repositories in GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure. It's more for like knowledge sharing. If you work internally with Azure and you want to share some code with your customers, so you create a public repo with this source code. But in general, I'm not aware of public open source work in these platforms.
I'm happy to get back to the requester on this particular issue and just say we're gonna wait until we get to 1.0 before we start talking about additional platforms. Is that okay with everybody?
I think that's good.
Okay. And I went through the minutes just now, and I bolded some things that we talked about doing. So I think we've got enough to-dos out of this meeting that was quite useful, actually. So what I was gonna suggest is that if possible, so when's our next best practices? I think our next best practices full working group call is next Tuesday. And what I will try to do is get some PRs, some of this work at least started by that time so that we can have something more to talk about on next week's best practices call. Okay.
In the general call or
In the
the
general call. Yeah, just as part of the update.
okay. Okay, because
That's
I won't make it to the next call. Like it's next week or
Next week's, yeah.
yeah. I can because we have like another vacation already. So so I can make it the next I think in Wednesday I can create the tooling.
If you want me to raise anything there on that call, let me know, and I'm happy to do that. Okay.
Thanks.
But otherwise we'll chat next week then. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Any other business? Anything else? Anybody wanted to raise? Good. Okay. So I will let people take a little break.
All right.
And Noam, you can go join your colleagues for happy hour.
Yeah.
We got mine coming up in an hour. So yeah.
All right.
Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.